Hello, everyone. As people are joining in, I'll give a little introduction. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. I'd like to welcome you all to our third installment of Cold War Spaces, our lunchtime talk series. So far, we've covered private space, we've covered public space. This week, we're going a bit more mysterious with secret space and the Stasi. We're joined by journalist and spokesperson for the Federal Commissioner for the Records of the State Security Service of the former German Democratic Republic in Berlin, Dagmar Hovestädt. In short, that's the archive of the East German Secret Police, also known as the Stasi. And after the discussion between Dagmar and Joes Segal, the chief programmer and curator of the Wende, there'll be a discussion for 30 minutes and then a 10-minute Q&A. So you can type your questions in the Q&A box during that 10-minute Q&A at the end. And this talk will be recorded and you can watch it afterwards on our Vimeo. And Joes, I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose, and welcome everyone. 2 days ago, BBC's Middle Eastern correspondent Tom Bateman reported that the Israeli Secret Service is using covert surveillance technology to track people's movements through their mobile phones in order to identify who has been in the vicinity of a confirmed COVID-19 patient. This has sparked uncomfortable questions about the balance between health protection and loss of privacy. With or without coronavirus, we are living in a surveillance society, observed by CCTV cameras and drones, while our electronic devices stream back data about ourselves with uncertain destinations. Today we are going to speak about secret space and surveillance in the electronically less sophisticated period of the Cold War, specifically about the East German Secret Service, the Stasi. What can we learn from the history of the Stasi to better understand the challenges that confront us today? I am delighted to welcome my guest, Dagmar Hovestädt, who as no other might be able to help unveil the history of secrecy. Welcome, Dagmar, and let me ask you a very blunt question at the start. The Stasi has made quite a name for itself on account of the intensity with which it spied on its own people, the East German citizens. Why did they do that?
Well, hello and welcome everybody to lunch hour. It's a bit later here in Berlin. And I just want to introduce, behind me, you can see a historic picture of the headquarters of the Stasi in the later 80s. So yes, why did they do what they did? Well, East Germany was a one-party system. And the idea was that only one party was politically in power and wanted to maintain this power. And that everybody wanted to conform to this one idea of who you wanted to be. And so a secret police was pretty much installed from the very beginning to make sure that those who didn't want to conform and didn't want to vote and obey the one party and wanted to express themselves differently would be found out and either brought back in line or would be persecuted, arrested, or kicked out of the country. And it's a little tough to talk about the Stasi as a one-term organization, because of course we're looking at 40 years of East German existence in the Cold War era as a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and let's call it a competitor to another version of being a German state, right? It was the East and West German states confronting each other at the core of the Cold War, so to speak. And so I also like to allude to the length of time and the different eras or decades that were in part of this experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us maybe a little bit about the tools the Stasi used to survey people, and also how did that impact people's sense of privacy? We had a discussion 2 weeks ago with Susan Reed about private space in the Soviet Union. How were people experiencing their private space knowing that they might be under surveillance?
Yeah, many people who actually lived in East Germany had this idea of this public persona of being somebody in the eyes of the party and giving what the party wanted and then withdraw into their private spaces. And if they somehow felt they were conforming to what was necessary, I don't think they would necessarily feel the Stasi everywhere and around them. But if somehow they expressed dissent, or knew that were not consenting to what was expected of them, the Stasi could actually encroach on their private lives in many ways. I actually prepared a few photographs from the Stasi, which I'm just going to introduce here. And let's just start from the beginning. This would be one of the many ways that the Stasi can inject itself into a person's life, by listening in on their phone conversations and recording it and typing up information that they have secretly found out in the space of a private conversation. The Stasi, the East German constitution did not allow to just listen in on phone conversations, but the Stasi felt it had any power to inject itself anywhere. And so mail control was also something that they would do. They had many rooms within the official postal offices, houses, and they would take boxes of mail and look through them, open the letters, and to the tune of some 1,000 letters a day in one of these small postal stations, and would then bring the letters to the Stasi headquarters, where they would either be photographed on microfiche or confiscated. And it was always about finding out something that was critical of this regime, or which is also something that they're very afraid of, that Germans planned to leave and move themselves or escape to West Germany. So it was always on the lookout for critical information or criticism of the state or plans to disappear. And of course, there was secret surveillance throughout the everyday life, but also on specific people that the Stasi had determined and defined as enemies of the state. And then they would spend days following them around, sometimes going into their apartments. It's quite critical to understand that these type of arsenals were only addressed at a very small amount of people, but really you don't necessarily have to address them to a lot of people. If you make good examples, the idea that the Stasi could be everywhere is much more powerful than having listening in on every phone all the time, or knowing that all my letters are being put under surveillance.
Right. So that of course involved huge size operations. Can you tell us how many people actually worked for the Stasi, either as official employees or unofficial agents, and also how were they attracted to the Stasi, or were they maybe coerced some way? How did that happen? Yeah.
Well, one of the most important information gathering tools I haven't mentioned, it's what we call in a little bit of a rough translation of the Stasi term, inoffizieller Mitarbeiter, unofficial collaborator or unofficial staffer. And that's a source of information that is even harder to detect, because it could be your neighbor, your co-worker, your friend at university or at work who was secretly delivering information on you to the Stasi. And so these unofficial collaborators or unofficial staffers, in the end of East Germany, they were around 180,000 of them. And the Stasi as a ministry had around 90,000. So you could say official staffers and unofficial collaborators, there's about 270,000 people working for the ministry. You have to say that the staffers, the official military rank and file, were on the payroll. Many of the collaborators were not. And of course, it started in the 50s and 60s with a much smaller group of people, but it was almost doubling every 10, 15 years in its size. So the largest was in the later 80s, 91,000 staffers at the ministry, and about double the amount of informants.
That's amazing. And those inofficiële Mitarbeiter, were they all ideologically enthusiastic about what they were doing, or were they sometimes also a bit critical? How did it work? How should you interpret these things?
It's certainly the numbers game is only giving you part of the story, right? East Germany had around in the end 16 million citizens, so people have made calculations, the ratio between informants and secret police members versus the total of the population, and the density in East Germany was certainly higher compared to any other, compared even to the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovakia at the time. They certainly had the largest amount of people that they recruited officially and unofficially. And to a certain degree, the majority of those spying or informing on their fellow citizens, because that's an important part. The enemy was the other citizen within the society. It wasn't so much the outside danger. It could be the person who didn't want to conform. And so it was best that you had some ideological conviction because you wanted to save socialism. You wanted to prevent it from failing. You wanted to find the enemies of the good cause. But of course, there were also situations where the Stasi either recruited someone as an informant by means of money, material goods, or better positions, or an apartment, or if you say you were a photographer, you could get some material prospect, like a camera, a great camera. And often sometimes people were recruited under duress, right? It was, if you wouldn't collaborate, you would not be able to go to university, or your family might be in a troublesome situation. And the Stasi was quite skilled psychologically, so they knew where to attack people and how to, make them conform in the apparatus, despite maybe their best intentions sometimes. But ultimately, every secret intelligence or intelligence body works with sources that are convinced it's a good thing to do that. If you coerce people and it's only money, in espionage, that works a little better. Within your own system, you were largely convinced that socialism was the better idea, and you wanted to help it and support it.
Yeah. And in those cases where people were actually threatened or coerced, did it happen that they sometimes also spread misinformation to the Stasi, or did they find ways to collaborate but not really collaborate, so to speak?
Right. So if you force a person, and it's sort of, he's in a very tough spot as a person, because it's about his mother, his father, his brother, and he's unwillingly delivering information. You try to hide as much, and you try to deliver them as little as possible. And the Stasi would sometimes counter-check the information, have a second informant there, and they would notice that you wouldn't really fully deliver and cooperate, and eventually they would sometimes let you go as an informant. It's very interesting that today we can look at all these records and the files of the informants and see the many stories of how the Stasi was able to recruit them, how they were able to develop a relationship over time, sometimes for a person to continuously tell stories. This idea of spreading false information is sometimes one of the more advanced forms of informants were tasked with that. It's part of a strategy that's called Zersetzung, or loosely translated as psychic demolition, or demolition of psyche, where the enemy, the ideological enemy the Stasi defined, would be attacked not by physical means, but by spreading falsehoods about the person, by spreading rumors about the person. And one of the most devastating rumors was to say that an opposition person was actually secretly working as an informant. So the Stasi knew that it was a bad idea, or it was seen socially as unacceptable to be an informant. So they themselves used the tactic to spread the rumor you were an informant, to discredit your trustworthiness within a group of dissidents.
That's so cynical, yeah. And I think many of our viewers today might have seen the film The Life of Others, Das Leben der Anderen, which of course depicts the workings of the Stasi in a cultural context. Could you say something about in how far this depiction of the Stasi is realistic?
Yeah, it's a story about a Stasi officer in the late 1980s who was tasked to observe people in the theater field. Artists and cultural people often were part of the more active dissident scene, so it makes a lot of sense that the Stasi would infiltrate in the background the scenery. There was always also an official control of arts and culture, because the Socialist Party, wanted socialist art. And so there was not only the secret observation, but there was also the official cultural policies that had to be observed, and the party secretary that had to be involved in the decision on what to put on stage. But here in this movie, they were sort of putting an actress and a director under surveillance. And ultimately the story has the great dramaturgical or idea that the Stasi officers, by listening in constantly on the opposition people and their thought, he would empathize with them. He would understand that being a Stasi officer and working for the party was the wrong thing, and he was helping them and undermining the surveillance.
Have you ever heard about something like that in real life?
I was going to say, in the end, there were 90,000 Stasi officers. There were personnel files. There's some people that got fed up with the work, that didn't want to continue. They, for health reasons, didn't work. But never ever did anybody, according to the documents, empathize with the other side, with those that were not in favor of socialism. So that is a fictional version that works well in the confined space of a 90 or 2-hour movie, but it's not necessarily the reality. It's kind of hard to understand or it's hard to fathom also because whoever works within the Stasi comes from a party point of view, and it's a very incestuous, almost paranoid apparatus. You reinforce the thinking, and it's this black and white thinking of everybody who doesn't toe the party line is an enemy. And so it's very hard to have a space for empathy and for coming out of this bureaucratic and very tight idea of having to follow the mission.
Right. And speaking about enemies, since the late 1970s and especially the 1980s, the dissident movement in East Germany grew stronger and stronger. Also the counterculture movements. How did the Stasi respond to that?
Well, it certainly responded with an increase in personnel by the mid-later 70s, because also the country opened itself up more to Europe, right? There was this whole process of collaboration in Europe. It's on the international scene. East Germany signed a bunch of treaties and promised the fulfillment of human rights, which in turn encouraged some of the artistic scenery to express itself more. And so there were more people that had to be brought under control, and the Stasi intensified this idea of Zersetzung, of silencing those that were encouraged, through the international treaties to express the artistic views that weren't in line with what the SED, the Socialist Party of East Germany, thought would be the right thing. So it meant more work for the Stasi, and at the same time, it shouldn't look like they were actually being repressive. And there was always this interesting idea that in the German case, you could be expelled to the West German side, right? So there was a loophole that made it possible for many of artists, writers, actors that sort of left East Germany for West Germany and continued their careers in the West German culture scene.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Stasi Archives, if I'm not mistaken, were founded on the Day of German Unity, October 3rd, 1990, and opened their doors in January 1992. Can you tell us a little bit about the mission of the Stasi Archives and how it developed over the next 30 years? I know this is a very broad question. Yeah.
I know. Let's just do the 30 years in 2 sentences.
Exactly.
I brought a few more pictures just to make that point. Not this one. There we go. So the 40 years of activity of the Stasi resulted in about what today is around 70 miles of records, right? So, and during the peaceful revolution of 89, 90, many of the dissidents and many of the people were just so fed up with the Stasi that they basically decided that, they wanted to look at these files. They wanted to find out, what did they store about me? They wanted to reclaim the stolen information, and to each their own file was something that they said during the revolution. And then in the process of East and West Germany coming together in 1990, the West German side wasn't so convinced that that's a great idea to open up, 40 years of secret documentation of state secrets, essentially, to the whole society. So the dissidents who had fought to occupy the buildings and to say these records now are ours, sort of fought throughout the revolution and the unification process to make this archive actually possible. So this is a picture from the summer of 1990, before unification, where they said occupied, the records are ours, and they were actually able to convince the West German side to open this archive. And this is January 1992, you're right. So with the day of unification, the archive was open, January 2nd, 1992. These are former dissidents who looked for the first time on their files and found out what the Stasi had done in the background, how they changed the course of their lives and reclaimed their fate, so to speak, by looking into what the state had done in the background. And so ever since then, this archive has been opened, and for the past almost 30 years, some 7 million requests in total have been made, 3 million of those by individuals, half of a million of those with repeat requests, looking at these files and trying to understand how the state had injected itself into their lives, and figure out how to regain the control. And it's been in that sense quite successful to many individuals to look into this information. And of course historians have looked at it, journalists have looked at it, and the fact that a secret archive from a secret organization, a secret state organization, was opened. It was quite a dominant feature of what happened throughout the post-unification process in Germany.
Right. So did I recognize Wolf Biermann on the right side of the last photograph? Yeah.
Very well. You saw Wolf Biermann and his wife, Pamela Biermann, and you saw Katja Havemann, the wife of the dissident, Jürgen Fuchs, another dissident. And to the very few people who might know, there was also Eva Maria Hagen in their picture. She is the mother of Nina Hagen, the punk singer.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So maybe the last point I want, before we go to the Q&A, I want to bring up is the historiography of the GDR, how historians have written about East German society, and in how far the Stasi has actually dominated the discourse about East Germany. And maybe also, was that right to do that, or was that one-sided? What is your take on it?
It's tough for me to just be completely neutral on how this worked. I think it was almost inevitable. Nobody had a script on how do you deal with East Germany, and certainly the unique situation that in Germany you had the unification of two halves of one country. And the West German experience of the past 40 years was dominating the way East Germany then, became part of the united Germany. And then the opening of the archive, the unleashing of the secrets, certainly, and the Stasi had amassed so much information on every little part of East German life that if it became to dominate the discourse, even though for people it was already clear that East Germany was not just the Stasi. The Stasi was an instrument of the party, but by the mere virtue that the records were accessible, and it was such a revelatory idea to look into the state secrets, it may have sort of skewered the appreciation or the looking at the complete picture, because the dictatorship does not work only through a repressive apparatus like the Ministry for State Security and the Stasi. They're certainly instrumental in that they inject themselves in the thinking of people, and there's always a control mechanism, and you always know that. But the norms of how to conform start in many ways with the school, with the youth organizations, with everything where the state and the party is and ask you to conform to it. And the Stasi is only there when you still don't want to obey and you still want to express yourself differently. So yes, I mean, it takes time. It was too close to the end of the East, and it was too new to look at these records. And obviously, tens of thousands of people, have been incarcerated, have been arrested for making use of human rights. Hundreds of people have been killed at the wall. In the 50s, many people have perished in the labor camps and in unjustified death sentences. And many million families have been affected by this repression. So it was also a negotiation about, celebrating also those who are documented in these records as those who wanted access to human rights and to freedom. And so it pays respect to them, but it also negates that the majority of people were somewhere in the middle, bystanders, and try to make a life in a dictatorship they had never chosen to live in. They were just born into it. So it's a big complex question, and even 30 years later, I think we're getting to a new phase where we're a little more looking at it as a historic period, and a new generation of Germans looks at how to deal with that.
So the 1990s saw the somewhat surprising phenomenon of nostalgia, this nostalgia among some people for the lost culture and society of East Germany. Do you think that the West German dominance in the historiography about East Germany might have played a role here? For instance, that people who didn't experience agency in the GDR now felt that they still didn't have agency because they were not part of the story of the GDR?
I think obviously it's quite hard to deal with the situation where you have grown up in a country that has disappeared. Now you're in a united Germany. Granted, it was a democratic election. The majority of East Germans, a vast majority, chose to become, a united Germany after the West German model. And yet there was very limited space to understand your connection and your role in the dictatorship, because the dialogue through publicity, the media, and these records was vastly dominated by Stasi. So if any of the West Germans, I would say the West Germans were not very interested in really asking questions about what life in East Germany must have been like, because the East Germans wanted to become like West Germans through their choice. And so I think, yes, it's hard to tell your story when the other side says, well, it was just East Germany, we're all with the Stasi, and we don't really need to bother much with what that country was about, And that space maybe comes out now, but certainly there wasn't too much room for it in the 90s.
I see. Okay, thank you. I suggest we go to the Q&A now. I want to ask everyone to put questions under the Q&A and not the chat, because that's where I'm looking. And let's start with a question by Mike Esser. When did the Stasi start to become operational? Did they have a predecessor organization, or were they built from scratch?
Well, they were not quite built from scratch, because everything was organized and started in Moscow with the Communist International. That started the political parties there. East Germany was founded in October 7, 1949, and the Stasi became a ministry in February 8, 1950. So about 4 months later, it was founded as a ministry. But the early training was throughout the police organs that the Soviets had installed. And there were, I think, in the earlier 50s, there were some 3,000 Soviet operatives on the ground instructing the building of the ministry and instructing the early Stasi officers in the craft of how to build this ministry and what to look for. It was like in 1950, I think they started with some thousands of people, and by 1953 they had already grown within 3 years to 10,000, because in 1953 in June, there was a workers' uprising, and the Stasi had failed to see that the people's discontent with the communist leadership was so large that there would be an uprising. And so the Stasi was punished, so to speak, by becoming a state secretariat for the next 4 years. Their first minister was demoted, there was an interim minister, and by 1957, the Stasi had its minister that lasted till the very end, Erich Mielke. And from then on, it grew even more throughout the decades in the quantity of people working there.
Right. The next question I see is from Patrick Tuchowitsky. could you quit? I assume that means could you quit as an employee of the Stasi? Or what happened if you wanted to quit?
Right. I mean, the recruitment was, you know, there was, as I said, sort of, I think before, it was kind of incestuous, also a little paranoid. There was a constant surveillance within the apparatus. So if you decided that being a Stasi officer was what you wanted as a career, it was very hard to get accepted, because they would always feel you, especially in the 50s when the wall wasn't up, you might have been a foreign agent. So there was always this paranoia that you might infiltrate, and you had to protect yourself against foreign influence there. So it's often that you were recruited from, especially in the 70s and 80s, from a family background. Children of Stasi officers were recruited to start with the Stasi. And also people from the military, from the People's Police were recruited into the Stasi. You had to be a party member, and you had to be 100% certain that the Communist Party is the right thing to do. So quitting was not really an option. Sometimes people had big alcoholic problems, especially in the 60s and 70s with the founders generation and with the consolidation of power, with the building of the wall. There was very limited ways of leaving the apparatus. In the 80s, it got a little more open in that sense, but leaving had consequences. You would never have a regular life. You may be able to become the gardener for the cemetery, and you would never lose the Stasi. You would always be in their side, because this incestuous or paranoia means you join them, you swear an oath, and you stick with them to the very end. You spend your holidays in Stasi organized vacation villages. Your kids play together, you know, and you build this huge community of the elite of socialism, who makes sure that the party's ultimate goal is reached. So there's very limited room for coming in without their choosing, or even leaving. There's few cases, but not really an option. It was the social costs were very high.
Okay, thanks. I see a few questions that connect past and present. I have one here from Marike Drost. Does the historical memory of the Stasi play a role in current public debates, discourse about privacy and surveillance in Germany?
Absolutely. I mean, not to last, but in 2013, when the Edward Snowden revelations were about, of course, you know, the baseline, or it's kind of a weird way of saying it, right? But it's sort of the surveillance benchmark for super surveillance is the Stasi, because it had this apparatus and this single-minded focus on putting their own people under surveillance in order to identify those that wouldn't work with the system. And so the comparisons are there. It's sort of difficult, because now we're in the digital world with a manifold amount of information. We have state actors, we have private actors. We're all participating in this data gathering, you know. May not be quite fair, but whenever you click on the app and you are okay with the user end agreement, you sign your name on the line to say I'm okay with all of this. Really, it shouldn't be that way, but it's a sort of a different set of a problem. What you can learn is that, and that's why the access to the archive is so great, if there's unchecked power, if there's no parliamentary control, if there's no public debate about it, and in East Germany you had no choice to publicly question the legitimacy of Stasi's information gathering. Power is information. Power is feeding a sense of almightiness and of a boundless interference with very personal lives. And it ultimately corrupts the relationship between the state and the citizen. There's no trust, and there's no respect, and there's no privacy. So with the Stasi, you can learn where this all leads to. And I'm not a big fan of comparing the amount of information, how much worse it is or not. The effects in a repressive regime, in a dictatorship, are much worse for the people, you know, but it should teach us vigilance, and it should teach us to understand what's going on. And we should, in a democracy, demand better treatment and demand to public discussions and safeguards, so that it doesn't run amok like a system that the Stasi was in a repressive dictatorship.
Okay, so the next question also connects past and present, but in a slightly different way. It's from Mark Valley. Uh, Cheeky
Hey, Mark.
question, he says. Yeah, you know each other. But did
Yeah.
the Stasi have a plan to mitigate a possible pandemic? It seems they'd be ideally set up for a contact tracing quarantine program. Did they use their vast trove of data for anything besides preservation, party power, public health, for instance?
Yeah, that would have, if the party had demanded it of them, they would have probably done so. There were a few pandemics in the East German times. I think there was, oh God, there's in the early 1970s, there was what they call the Hong Kong flu that happened in East Germany, and there's another diarrhea-focused pandemic that happened there. I think all the Stasi did in those days, though, was just making sure they would not lose control of the information and support the health sector system. But they had not a plan installed to say what to do with it. It would have probably been a good use of their powers of injecting themselves in every little area to get all the information together. But really their goal was always make the party happy, and if that was something what the party wanted, they probably would have done it, but they wouldn't have chosen on their own to go after it.
Right. So we have a huge number of questions this week, which is very nice, but unfortunately we won't be able to cover all of them. But actually, many participants asked a variation on the same question, which is, did the Stasi remain contacts, or were they in touch with other secret organizations in other socialist countries? Did they
Absolutely
exchange information?
Yes, they absolutely did. It was an evolving system, as in the early days there was always a narrow contact with the Soviet side, with the KGB, not only from the early days where the KGB, the NKWD, or the KGB instructed the Stasi in its formation years and taught them how to do it, till the very last day. And the most well-known liaison officer was Vladimir Putin, who was from 1985 through 1990, February, in Dresden, stationed in Dresden as a KGB, within the KGB liaison office. And he was using the Stasi's assets in West Germany, because it was an ideal front for the KGB, because Germans were Germans, and if you had recruited an informant in the German situation between East and West Germany, the KGB was always not too far away. But also in the 60s and 70s, there was a coordinated effort into the 80s between all the other Eastern Warsaw Pact secret services, for the exception of Romania. That kind of disappeared in the 60s because then Ceausescu went his own way. But there was also a system of intelligence gathering in the electronic field. It was called SUD, S-O-U-D, where they would feed information of problematic persons or assets among them. It never really got off the ground, but we have some rests of the system in the archive as well. And certainly the Stasi used the Czech and the Hungarian intelligence services to stop East Germans from trying to escape through the Hungarian or Czech borders to West Germany or Austria. So they had certainly a lot of intelligence exchanges. Right. Throughout the Eastern European part. The rest of the world were their enemies. And in the third world, they had also many contacts to the communist-oriented third world countries. So in Africa, there was connection to Syria, there were connections to Iraq, to the Ba'ath Party, considering itself a part of the communist world. Of course, there was connections to Cuba and to some of the Latin American countries. So in the foreign espionage branch, the Stasi was pretty active worldwide.
All right. And the next question is by Alejandra Espasande. Was the Stasi influenced by Nazi practices of control?
Yeah, that's Yeah, that's a good question. People have often asked if the Stasi learned from the Nazis or even the Prussians how to build an archive, how to, to put pieces on, to document their work, or even to interrogate from the Nazis directly. But that was philosophically, ideologically impossible. The Stasi was very adamant about not having anybody from the more brutal secret services of the Nazi era, the SS or the SA, in their own ranks. And they didn't want any Nazi party member in their ranks, and they certainly didn't want to continue any of their practices. It was a matter of ideology and, in that sense, maybe pride. And really they didn't need to do, because from the Stalinist era, there was an arsenal of very repressive, brutal techniques that they could continue to use. But there was really a break with the Nazi era that was ideologically important.
Sure, yeah. So David Burton asks, after unification, did former Stasi employees feel any sort of guilt or remorse for what they participated in? Did they hide their connection to the Stasi? If not, did they become pariahs in unified Germany?
That's another great, interesting question. Part of the fight for opening the archive and the records was to make the secret connection to the Stasi public knowledge. So all the informants to this very day can get outed by accessing these records. And the staffers of the ministry are all publicly known. They were not allowed to continue working in public administration for the first couple of years. And now that sort of 30 years later, that is not so much relevant anymore, but the disclosure and the vetting against the records for secret informing is still active today. If you work in public administration and you were born to a certain degree and you had a meaningful lifetime in East Germany, you could still get vetted against the Stasi records. And if you'd been an informant, you will have to explain yourself about this. So did they feel sorry for themselves? They felt, I would say, in this very hot debate of the 90s, they felt certainly stigmatized. They felt left alone by the party, because it was quite easy for the Communist Party that renamed itself and became part of the parliamentary system in the United Germany. They basically dumped all the problems and the repression on the Stasi. So they became the scapegoat for the Communist Party, which made them mad. They became stigmatized to the public discourse, and there was little room for them to even publicly acknowledge or reflect. They were quite, they felt like the losers of the Cold War. They felt like the losers of the United Germany, and it was very hard for them to find a space. But then it's a democracy, so they're citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany with all the rights that they have. So they have organizations, they have the party still as their voice. And some of them, I've met a couple of them, not only informants, but even a Stasi officer who came to understand that they were serving the wrong cause. But then they often get looked as a traitor by their old comrades. So these people that are courageous or open enough to understand that they might have believed, thinking it was the right cause, only understood they were the wrong means to achieve that cause. They're very few, and they're between both worlds, so it's also a hard position for them.
Right. I have another interesting question, and this might actually be the last, given that we are almost out of time, by Edwin van der Veld, who asks, the Stasi had so much information on some of their victims. How did they organize their files, and could they keep order in this overabundance of surveillance?
Yeah, that to me is one of the most fascinating parts of doing this job and understanding the archive better, right? Because they did work with computers starting in the late 60s, avoiding the sanctions and getting their hands on some decent IBM computers. And so there was possibilities of information storage and cross-checking, cross-referencing much easier. But the performance of an intelligence body works with instant access to up-to-date information. And so the Stasi devised interesting ways of doing that, one of which is an index card system. I mean, we have 41 million index cards, and there's over 4,500 systems within them, centralized and decentralized index card systems. So they hold information and they pave the way to information. It's quite fascinating to understand how they could connect information in the south of East Germany, let's say in Suhl or Dresden, with information in Rostock without the help of computers or faxes or even long distance lines. And it is the mechanisms of secrecy and information distribution and updating information is quite fascinating, to the point that I think, even though sometimes it's been said they gathered so much information they lost control over it, I would not think that at all. They were quite skilled at doing this, even though it was often overwhelming and things might fall through the cracks, you know, as everywhere. But all in all, the system is quite impressive.
Dagmar, thank you so much. You gave us fascinating insights in the workings and also the reflection on the Stasi. It was wonderful to have you here. Next week, my guest will be Ksenia Vituleva-Hertz, and with her I will speak about shadow spaces, secret Soviet cities in transition. So I hope to see you back next Wednesday, same time.
All right, thank you. It was great. And have a good rest of the day over there on the West Coast.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right, you're welcome. Bye.